Hey, Father Paul. Hey, thanks for uploading that video. I learned now that I got to have two people recording as a backup because somehow it has stayed on me the whole time till about halfway through. So, yeah, I'm glad you, did that. So, yeah, we're gonna appreciate all the transcripts. That's going to be really helpful down the road too. So now I'm getting ready. I got my video editor, and I was the other night, and going to start really putting it together and professional with our, theological institute. And so now we never have to do this class again. We can have another professor and then teacher and work with the guys. And and your transcript's helpful too for the professor to look through there and pick out questions to ask to make sure people watch the video and that kind of stuff.
Well, good. I'm glad it's helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, we got a lot more people. We had on the first version, we got 63 people have watched that video.
Really?
Yeah, one of the other ones is 54 people watched the video. And that's a lot more people than we have in our class.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's great too. That's why I need to do like a little introductory on the first one, and then do, what the book is, and kind of tweak those, edit them out a little bit to where we introduction and all that stuff to them.
Good.
only thing he's gonna do with himself.
Your Grace, did you happen to catch my email?
Yes, I did.
Is that okay?
That's fine.
Okay. I don't know if it's at my end or where the server issue is.
It's probably my end because this house is built like the proverbial battleship.
Oh, okay.
So the connection between me and the box of tricks on the downstairs is a little bit.
Okay.
It's okay most of the time, but if next door decides to watch football on the, I've had it. It's
Yeah. All right. Okay. As I said, we only experienced it a couple of times, but just in case.
Yeah. I usually notice it's around 7:15 when it starts getting unstable, which is like when everybody goes, "I've had my dinner. What do I do now?" Yeah, the worst bit was where I used to live in England. We were at the end of a dead-end street. And at the end of the dead-end street was the district council's IT office.
Yeah.
So you try getting on the internet there.
Oh,
whoa.
Yeah. Was I accurate in my guess? What was it? James fancied himself as a peacemaker.
Fancied himself as a theologian.
See, that was what I originally had, but I changed it. Okay.
Yeah.
So, Father Patrick and Father Paul, when you get to that part of the transcript, change peacemaker to theologian. James considered himself a theologian.
It's kind of 90 days same as cash on those two with James. There we go. See if we get a bit more light on the subject at my end.
All right, Archbishop. Thank you again for coming here and enlightening us all. And go ahead and take it away.
Okay, we'd got to the beginning of the reign of Charles I last week. And Charles really marks a departure from his father's policy in two respects. First of all, unlike James I, who used to talk an awful lot about the divine right of kings but never did anything about it, Charles was quite a sincere believer, to the point where he said, no man hath any right to judge a king, and so on. And there's many similar remarks recorded of Charles. He was also an inveterate opponent of the Puritan tendency. I think a lot of it has to do with sociology as much as religion. Charles tended to stand up for aristocratic values and traditional forms of government against the aspirations of the rising mercantile class. Geoffrey Elton's somewhat Marxist analysis of 17th century history holds up thus far. And as increasingly Parliament was drawn from the mercantile class, particularly the great boroughs like London, Southampton, Bristol, Liverpool, The result of this was that there was an increasing tension between the Crown on one hand, that was trying to guard its traditional prerogatives, and Parliament, which was looking for some sort of readjustment in the relative relationships between Crown and Parliament. And this spilled over into the Church in a couple of ways. First of all, an awful lot of the English middle class were influenced by Puritan ideas. There's almost a connection between the great London guilds and Puritan preaching in this period. And the king, on the other hand, tended to favour the group of high-flying clerics that had gathered around Richard Neile, the Bishop of Durham. Now, Richard Neil's one of those figures who is important not for who he was and what he knew, but for who he knew. And all of the major Arminian, and I use that word loosely in the English context, Arminian clergy of Charles's reign have some sort of an association with Neile. So George Mountain, John Overall, Archbishop Laud, the whole crew have some sort of an association with Neile. And Neile's house in London as Bishop of Durham, just off the Strand, was a meeting place for this particular pressure group. Now, James, in his episcopal appointments, had tended to appoint mainly church Calvinists. People like John Bancroft, the two Abbott brothers, they were the safe choice. They followed on from the Reformed theology of Queen Elizabeth's reign. They were also very much in tune with James himself, who, whatever his personal peccadillos, and there were quite a lot of them, was nonetheless a moderate Calvinist and a firm supporter of episcopacy. So he tended to pick bishops in that mould. However, towards the end of his reign, he started appointing men who came from what's loosely described as the Arminian side of the church. And English Arminianism and Dutch Arminianism are not the same. English Arminianism, really, in terms of its attitude towards predestination and election, is much closer to Luther than Arminius. And as a result of this, you have this fundamental misunderstanding that somehow Arminius's ideas are terribly influential in England, where in fact it's the English doing their own thing to a certain extent. The leader of the group really was Lancelot Andrews. And Andrews is a leftover from Elizabeth's reign, although he doesn't become a bishop under Elizabeth. He does, however, become Dean of Westminster, so he's just on the edge, ready to become a bishop when James comes to the throne in 1603. He does a fairly short circuit in terms of bishoprics at the time. He's Bishop of Ely for many years and then is translated to Winchester. And he is regarded as the greatest preacher of the age. Unlike a lot of English theologians of that period, he was well acquainted with the Greek fathers, particularly John Chrysostom. And he works out his theology more in terms of the early fathers than in continental, in terms of what was going on, on the other side of the English Channel. And he influences a whole generation of rising clerics, such as George Montaigne, William Laud, Richard Neile, John Overall, who gradually feed into the upper reaches of the church during the latter years of James' reign. English Arminianism is always associated with William Laud, who I think probably gets the blame, as it were, because he was the noisiest one of the lot. Laud, for me, is an extremely unattractive figure. He is small, he's pompous, he's hot-tempered. He's an old man in a hurry by the time he becomes Bishop of London in 1628. And as such, he's really his own worst enemy for much of his career. He was a successful academic. He was a fellow, then principal of St. John's College, Oxford, who was vice-chancellor of the university before he started receiving higher preferment in the church. He was briefly Bishop of St. David's. He was translated to Bath and Wells, then on to London and finally to Canterbury. And he formed a close relationship with Charles whilst he was still Prince of Wales. I suppose he was one of the few people Charles I could look in the eye. And as a result of this, he was very much a favourite with Charles, but with nobody else. Laud's background as a theologian is not that impressive. He's a good, solid churchman. He has considerable administrative ability, and that's the source of his preferment. His main contribution to literature are his disputations with Fisher the Jesuit from 1622, which, although it shows him to be, in the traditional sense, a Calvinist, in the sense of William Perkins, it does nonetheless show him to be hostile to Rome. So later Puritan accusations that Laud was trying to lead the Church of England back to the Church of Rome are utterly false. Laud himself, though, had this sort of what I would call prelate complex. He liked the traditional trappings of his office. So, you know, he arrived at Lambeth in a carriage with 20 or 30 outriders. He kept court, basically, in Lambeth Palace. And this tended to foster resentment on the part of the more Puritan-inclined folks in the city. Laud is particularly associated with Thomas Wentworth, Black Tom Tyrant, the Earl of Strafford. And as Strafford was essentially Charles's viceroy in secular affairs, so Archbishop Laud was Charles's viceroy in ecclesiastical affairs. And the one thing that Laud was absolutely determined to put down was the sort of aggressive political Puritanism, which was increasingly a factor in the 1620s. And their demands for reform of the church had developed into two distinct groups of demands. The first is essentially ecclesiastical. They wanted the abolition of the surplice. They wanted rid of the ring-in matrimony. They wanted rid of the ceremony of bowing at the name of Jesus. They wanted rid of the long, complex morning service, which Puritan misbehavior a couple of generations earlier had forced on the English church. But there are other demands, such as the establishment of a quasi-Presbyterian system, were supported only by a minority of Puritans at the beginning of Charles's reign. And just as you have great difficulty defining what a Laudian or an English Arminian is, I've never really improved on the definition that was given about 1629 by a disgruntled courtier who, when asked what do the Laudians hold, replied, all the best bishoprics and deaneries in England. They were a clique particularly associated with Charles. Theologically, they're not particularly coherent. On the other hand, who is a Puritan and who isn't a Puritan is often very difficult to decide. Laud basically seemed to define a Puritan as anybody who disagreed with him, who wasn't a papist. Similarly, the Puritans themselves recognized that they were a really quite diffuse movement. On the one hand, folks like to claim that separatists, such as the folks who sailed in the Mayflower and ended up in Massachusetts, were Puritans, but they were at the extreme left wing of Puritanism because they were prepared to separate from the Church of England. On the other hand, you have bishops like John Williams, who was every bit as much of a high churchman as Laud in his way, but who still held to the old Calvinist theology, described as being Puritan simply because they opposed Laud's, semi-Arminian theology. So neither movement is particularly sharply defined, except in terms of politics. And what you see in the form of the Laudians is the sort of well-organized pressure group that you later get in the 19th century with the Tractarians. And they are very, very good at using their influence to get their men into key positions. So you have a succession of Laudians in the Diocese of York. You have a succession of Laudians in the Diocese of London. But the biggest plum of all, Canterbury, doesn't fall to them until 1633, when poor old George Abbot dies. And George Abbot would have been a very good bishop in Queen Elizabeth's reign, but by the reign of James I, he'd rather outlived his usefulness. One significant problem that he had was that he accidentally shot a gamekeeper in 1621, which led to him being suspended as Archbishop of Canterbury for a while. And this leads to an interesting glitch in the English apostolic succession, because William Laud was consecrated whilst the Archbishopric of Canterbury was in administration, and consequently his principal consecrator was George Mountain, and one of the co-consecrators was Mark Antonio de Dominis, who was the former Roman Catholic Archbishop of Spoleto. And Laud is one of those who like to make life difficult for Abbot. He kicks up a fuss over the Archbishop being a man of blood because of the manslaughter case. He then, as Bishop of St. David's, then of Bath and Wells, applies the 1604 canons to the letter. He's very much orientated towards discipline. As Vice-Chancellor at Oxford University, by the way, their statutes, which were still in use in the 1870s, were called the Laudian Code, because he'd been the one who'd collated the whole together. He was notorious for the strictness of his discipline, and this applies to the whole of Laud's career. Now, Charles, although he might be regarded as a martyr by some, also has to go down in English history as being one of its daftest kings. He was totally unable to absorb the idea that it was not possible to rule England without regular parliaments. He fell back on the perfectly legal but outmoded method of government, of just simply relying on his own revenues to maintain the machinery of government. Now, one interesting side effect of this is that for 13 years, England stays clear of European entanglements. There are no significant wars, because wars cost money. Money means parliament, and the last thing James I wants to have to deal with is a parliament. Charles I wants to deal with is a parliament, because they will be fractious and demand reforms in the church, reforms in the government, the dismissal of some of the king's favourites, a reform of the customs and excise duties in favour of the merchants, an abolition of monopolies whereby certain commodities such as soap were produced by monopolies. And the two principals, for example, in the soap monopoly were a couple of Roman Catholics, which led to the whole Pope soap scandal in the 1630s. Also, Laud was very keen on censorship. He was not afraid to censor sermons. He was not afraid to censor theological works, and his censorship was generally aimed at the Puritans. So what is building up during the early part of Charles's reign is a boatload of resentment against the regime. And it's not helped by the fact that Charles has some really stupid ideas. First of which is trying to bring the Scottish Church into conformity with the English. Now, his father had talked about that, but knowing James I, it was a bargaining chip to keep the Kirk under control. Now, the 5 Articles of Perth had required that the Scots accept bishops, that they accept confirmation, that they accept godparents, that they accept kneeling at communion, and that they allow baptism by lay people. But other than that, James had not interfered with the Scottish Church. Charles, on the other hand, commissions a couple of his Scottish bishops, one of whom is Francis Wedderburn, to write a new prayer book. And although it does make some concessions to Scottish opinion, for instance, the consistent use of the word presbyter instead of priest throughout the text, the use of the King James version of the Bible instead of the Bishop's Bible for the text of Scripture. There's one or two actually that other quotations come from the Genevan version. It's a book that goes a long way back in the direction of the 1549 liturgy. So the epiclesis is reintroduced. There is a definite offertory in the communion service. And all of these changes cumulatively, although there's really nothing in it that contradicts Reformed theology, upset a great body of opinion in Scotland. And the beginning of Charles's decline comes with the imposition of the prayer book in Scotland, which he imposes by royal decree in 1637. And of course, it's part of Scottish folklore that when the service is first read in the High Kirk of Edinburgh, St Giles, which at that time was briefly functioning as a cathedral, Bishop Wedderburn and the Dean go to the receipts, start reading the prayer book service, and they're greeted with such a symphony of boos, catcalls, and low-flying stools that they have to give up the attempt. And the Scots, who definitely like a good story, have a bronze replica of Jenny Geddes' stool there in the High Kirk of Edinburgh as a memorial to the prayer book riot of 1637. The unfortunate part of all this is that it provides a focus for the opposition to Charles. The Scots begin to circulate a solemn league and covenant requiring, amongst other things, the abolition of episcopacy. The Scots then rebel against Charles, and in the ensuing Bishops' War, march as far south as Ripon in the West Riding of Yorkshire. And at that point, Charles makes a treaty with them in which he agrees to pay the expenses of the army, whilst the matter is arbitrated. Now, Charles, being an absolute monarch, never really feels bound to keep his word if it's against the interests of the monarchy. So although Charles manages to secure first a truce and then the dissolution of the Scottish army that's resident in England, he is left with a thumping great bill to pay, which means he has to call Parliament. The short Parliament of 1640 says, no money without reform. Charles dissolves Parliament. There are new elections. The Long Parliament is elected, and we take another trip around the mulberry bush. And as this bad-tempered confrontation continues, England slowly divides into two camps. Those who support the claims of the king as being based on law, and those who support the claims of Parliament, which they feel are based upon justice. And eventually the whole thing does come to blows. Charles attempts another reconciliation with Parliament early in 1642. This fails. He retires north into Yorkshire. He attempts to seize the Royal Arsenal at Hull and is refused admission to the city by Sir John Hotham at the Beverley Gate. If you go to, it's just by the Maritime Museum in Hull, there's a hole in the road, and there's the foundations of Beverley Gate down there, which is where Sir John Hotham refused admission to Charles I. And that is the real beginning of the English Civil War. The English Civil War is like most English civil wars. It's not particularly civil, and it's not much of a war. There's a sort of long series of not particularly conclusive military engagements between royalist and parliamentarian forces through 1642, 1643, and 1644. My hometown, both churches lost their stained glass in 1643 after the Earl of Manchester defeated a small royalist force on the hill behind Barton-on-Humber, and in his in their elation at having driven the royalists off, they came into town and broke every single stained glass window they could find and wrecked the interior of both churches. Such inconveniences apart, my hometown largely escaped the Civil War, even though it was directly across from Hull where it started. The long story was that the war was inconclusive until Parliament really got down to the business of organising the army. So you have the new model, and you have effective field commanders like Lord Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell, and they turned the tide against the king. The king is absolutely determined to hang on to power somehow. So we go through a whole series of agreements. He sacrifices the Earl of Strafford to the wrath of Parliament. He then sacrifices Archbishop Laud to the wrath of Parliament. They're both executed via the legal fiction of an act of attainder, which means they are basically ruled to be guilty by Parliament without much of a trial. The king, to save his own bacon, doesn't intervene to prevent the execution of Strafford. He doesn't intervene to prevent the execution of Laud, although in both cases it's dubious if he could have done so. In 1646, he's quite happy to make a deal with the Presbyterians to try and maintain royal power. In 1648, he tries again to broker an alliance with the Scots to defeat parliamentary attempts to take control of the English government. And it's at that point that Oliver Cromwell pretty much decides that Charles Stuart, that man of blood, has to go. So you have the trial in Westminster Hall, followed by the Bill of Attainder, followed by the execution of Charles I on the 30th of January 1648, which is the old style date, which is why the regicides and those who supported them are known as the Men of 48. Now, occasionally the worst thing you can do is execute your leading opponent, because it makes a martyr out of them. And Charles, whatever his faults as a king, was a devout, holy, and faithful man. He is one of the few English kings with no recorded extramarital affairs. There's significant evidence that he actually did something very unusual for a 17th century monarch: love his wife. They had a large and, for the most part, happy family. Charles's children, if they're dysfunctional at all, are dysfunctional because of what happened to them in exile, not because of their childhood. Charles II was a rake, but he was a very well-adjusted rake, because he'd had a happy and stable childhood down to the age of 12. You know, his mother and father genuinely loved each other. There was a lot of love in the home. So that side of Charles is highly commendable. He may have been a fool as a king, but he was a good man. And shortly after his death, a little book appears, the Icon Basilicon, the image of the king, which was compiled by Bishop Gouden out of the writings that the king had left at the time of his execution, and it becomes, in 17th century terms, a bestseller. And it promotes the image of Charles, king and martyr. So, we have Charles the martyr. We have Laud, the martyred archbishop. What do we have for a church? Episcopacy and the prayer book are abolished in 1644. Parliament attempts to establish Presbyterianism in 1645. This is prevented by the independents. Oliver Cromwell, who by 1648 is the dominant figure on the parliamentary side, basically grants freedom of worship except for Episcopalians and Catholics. But the Puritans, the Puritan dictatorship, the military regime that Oliver Cromwell creates cannot furnish a stable church or a stable government. So England gradually lapses into military dictatorship, and that military dictatorship also controls Scotland and Ireland. And in Ireland, it's very bloody indeed. The infamous siege of Drogheda takes place during this period, where Cromwell orders the butchering of the Catholic defenders of the town, man, woman, and child, as an act of vengeance. There's similar incidents all the way through the war in Ireland, because Cromwell's stated aim is to drive the Catholics to either hell or Comet. And he isn't particularly choosy which. Oliver Cromwell successfully governs England through a military dictatorship backed up by a purged parliament. But when he dies in 1658 and is replaced by his son Richard, there's a real power vacuum. Richard isn't his father. Furthermore, Richard doesn't really think he has a right to rule. He inherits the title Lord Protector from his father, but he's protecting the kingdom for what? And so the feeling grows as the Puritan regime fails to produce a stable government that there's been a great mistake. And influential sections of the governing class begin to look at the alternatives. And eventually General Monk takes the initiative contacting Charles II, and negotiations begin to bring the king back from exile. The legal fiction in English history, by the way, is that King Charles II's reign started the moment the axe fell on his father's neck. So, Acts of Parliament from 1661 are dated the 12th year of the reign of King Charles II, as though the interregnum, the Commonwealth, had never existed. Charles is as unprincipled and suave as his father was stiff and actually somewhat a slightly angular figure in English history. Charles is a total contrast to his father in more ways than one. He doesn't have much in the way of fixed opinions on religion. He's tall, he's almost 6 foot. He's dark, he's handsome, he's a skirt chaser. He likes food, drink, music, doesn't much care for sermons. He likes the theatre. He has enormous debts. And when he comes into his own in May 1660, he does so on the basis of a brokered truce, as it were, in English ecclesiastical affairs. It's understood that in the interim he will grant freedom of religion until a final settlement is worked out. This had brought the Presbyterians over to Charles's side. It also prevented groups like the Independents and the Fifth Monarchy men and the Diggers being too much of a problem. And as a result of this, Charles has a great diversity of opinion supporting him when he comes to power. And one of the first things he does very gently is allow the Church of England more or less to restore itself. The old bishops come back. People like Brian Dupper, Bishop Juxon of London, the old Bishop Sid Surf of Orkney reappear. They go back to their cathedral cities. They start the slow process of rebuilding the church's administration after an interval of 16 years. The king starts appointing new bishops. For example, he translates Juxon from London to Canterbury. Humphrey Henchman, who, apart from his splendidly gloomy name, also had a splendidly gloomy reputation, becomes Bishop of London. And there's this slow process of reactivating the Church of England, which culminates in two things. First of all, the Savoy Conference. The Savoy Conference was supposed to be the means by which the chief Puritan grievances would be addressed, so that the vast majority of English Protestants could be brought under the Church of England. It went rather badly wrong for a couple of reasons. First of all, the bishops were fairly determined to make as few concessions as possible, but that needn't necessarily have derailed the whole thing. The unfortunate thing was on the other side, where the leaders of the Puritan delegation, for example, Reynolds and wrote the Reformed pastor. Name's gone. And they had the management of the business.
Richard
and
Baxter.
As a result of it, Richard Baxter, thank you. Instead of going after a few major points, they went after everything. And there's a rather famous rebuke when they're talking about the burial office. They wanted the rubrics to the burial office to be changed to say that the whole thing could take place in church if it was raining. And the bishops just simply replied, "This matter is better addressed by a hat than a rubric." And this sort of nitpicking approach meant that in the end, the bishops conceded very few points to the moderate Puritans, the Presbyterians. And as a result of this, the law of unintended consequences really kicked in a bad way. First of all, the 1662 prayer book, although it addressed a lot of minor Puritan concerns, chiefly by replacing the readings from the Bishop's Bible with the text from the 1611 translation, didn't really address any of the major Puritan concerns. However, the Black Rubric reappears after an absence of 103 years, amended to say no corporeal presence instead of no real and essential presence, in order to exclude transubstantiation. The bishops also take care of a few minor errors in the text, but generally the 1559 prayer book is reformed, but a lot of as many of the reforms come from the Laudian side as they do from the Puritan side. So, for example, the manual acts that we perform every time we celebrate communion, as they're described in the text of the prayer book, well, I hope that's what you're doing, are there because the Laudians wanted them. So, take the bread, break it, lay your hand upon it, take the cup, lay your hand upon it. These gestures came in the 1662 prayer book. Similarly, the permission to allow parents to stand as godparents, which we have in the 1928 prayer book, is a belated 1789 concession of a Puritan point. There's also the office for the baptism of adults, which became necessary because during the Commonwealth, not every child had been baptized. And there's also, of course, the growing awareness of the church's missionary responsibility in the American colonies. The subtitle of the service for the baptism of adults in the 1662 prayer book, it has a little line about for the baptism of natives in our colonies. So there is some attempt to accommodate Puritan concerns, but in the end it isn't enough. So in 1662, when the Act of Uniformity is passed, it covers the old Episcopalians. A lot of moderate Presbyterians seek episcopal ordination because they want to keep their offices, they want to continue their ministries. They're not that disenchanted with Anglicanism that they want nothing to do with it. They see it as another branch of the Reformed Church. They may not agree with its form of government, but they can live with it. On the other hand, you have the die-hard element, people like Richard Baxter, who, when the gate is closed on the 24th of August, 1662, Black Bartholomew's Day, go out into nonconformity. Now, the original intention of Charles II had been to grant limited toleration so that Orthodox Protestant dissenters could be nonconformists with a clear conscience. However, Parliament was dominated by the sons of the men and the sons of the men who had fought on the Royalist side in the English Civil War. So they were not going to grant any quarter to those who opposed the Church of England. So you have the Clarendon Code, which, for example, requires all those who are elected as officers of city corporations to not only attend public worship according to the rites of the Church of England, but also to be communicants. Also, you have the Conventicle Act, which prevents those ejected in 1662 from ministering within 5 miles of their former parish. And there's a whole bunch of legal restrictions that are placed on nonconformists. And as far as it was possible for the law to prescribe nonconformist religious groups, that is the situation for the remainder of Charles's reign legally. But Charles being Charles, you do of course have the Declaration of Indulgence in 1672, which basically temporarily suspends the Clarendon Code. Also, you have a growing controversy towards the end of Charles's reign. Charles may have been very good at begetting children, but unfortunately it was not with his wife. And as a result of this, the heir apparent was James II, James Duke of York, later James VII and II, Dismal Jimmy as the Scots refer to him, and he was an out-and-out Roman Catholic. So the first real outbreak of political parties in English religious life comes towards the end of the reign of Charles II, when, in the wake of the Papist plot and the exclusion crisis, the English political world is divided into Whigs and Tories. And the two names are both insulting. The Whigs, their name derives from Whigamore, which was a Scottish cattle driver, brackets cattle rustler, and the Tories were named after Irish pirates. And the Tories favoured a strictly legitimate succession, so James II would succeed his brother, despite the fact he was a papist, whereas the Whigs favoured the exclusion of James II and the accession of his Protestant daughter, Mary. And with that rumbling along in the background, Charles II's reign closes with the king dying at the age of 55, basically, I think, of good living. He apologizes, for example, to his doctors for being an unconscionable time of dying. He says goodbye to his favourite mistress, Nell Gwynn. He also calls for Father Huddleston, the Catholic priest who had hid him after the Battle of Worcester in 1650, and he is received into the Roman Catholic Church on his deathbed. His brother Charles's accession follows as smoothly as can be expected, and the stage is set for the next big revolution, both in English political and in English religious life, and we'll be taking a look at that next week. Okay, folks.
Archbishop, this is Father Paul Slash. And when you said, I think it was Laud and another gentleman, the Stockman or something like that, the charge was attainder. And
yes.
You said it was much of a trial. What could you elaborate a little bit on what attainder means?
It's basically treason. And the act of attainder was a parliamentary device which meant they didn't stand a normal trial in the courts by jury. They were tried by Parliament. And in the past, it had been used in mainly in cases of treason, where nobles had rebelled against the king. And instead of submitting to trial by a jury of their peers, they'd appealed to Parliament to be tried. There's rather an interesting Ealing comedy from the 1950s, I believe it is, called Kind Hearts and Coronets, where the principal character bumps off his relative, so he becomes Duke of something or other. And he asked to be tried by the House of Lords, which was his right as a peer. In the same way, Parliament had the right to try certain prominent malefactors who they felt would unduly influence the regular course of justice.
So did these two men, Laud and the other gentleman,
Trafford.
did they really do anything wrong or treasonous, or is this just a kangaroo court?
In the case of Laud, was essentially kangarooed. Strafford had spent an awful lot of time right on the line between legal and illegal. But much of his unpopularity stemmed from his time as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, in which he had taken steps to recover church property that had been alienated during the reign of Elizabeth I. And that made him very unpopular with some of the beneficiaries, such as the Drapers Company in London, who had made a great deal of money out of former church lands in County Londonderry and County Donegal. So it's right on the edge of what is and isn't legal.
All right, thank you.
Grace?
Yes, Paul?
Yes. Now, we've touched on this before, but I'm hoping that you can take a few minutes and elaborate a little bit. Historically speaking, we have three main branches of Christianity at this time in history. We have Rome, Orthodoxy, and Anglicanism.
Right.
All three claim that clergy functions according to apostolic succession. That's the derivative authority. What do we do now, historically, with the break, considering nonconformists and others who are now claiming to minister in the body of Christ?
Right. This is where the Church of England changed its policy. From 1559 through to 1662, as a general rule, Lutherans and Reformed church pastors who had been ordained abroad, and please note, ordained abroad, were accepted in the Church of England without reordination. That ends in 1662. The one exception is Sweden, because Sweden preserves the historic episcopate. And there are attempts, we'll get to that episode next week, as early as 1700 to broker an intercommunion agreement between the Church of England and the Church of Sweden, courtesy of a bishop by the name of John Robinson, by the way, who was the minister plenipotentiary in Stockholm at the time. And even after 1662, foreign Protestant ministers are received into the Church of England on pretty easy terms. A lot of Huguenot ministers in 1689, 1690 come to England. They're either allowed to minister to Huguenot congregations, or they are conditionally ordained into the Church of England, or more often the Church of Ireland, which explains half of the French surnames in the Church of Ireland. The other half came with the Normans. So, you know, there's a very real change of policy there in 1662, mainly because of the spectre of domestic nonconformity.
It would seem then that not only was it a change of policy, But apparently, it was also a change of theology surrounding what apostolic succession, A, meant, and B, its import when considering who ministers with any authority.
Yeah, the Church of England becomes much more rigid about apostolic succession when confronted with the problem of nonconformity at home. You can almost see the century between 1560 and 1660 as being a century where the brotherhood of Protestants was more important in pragmatic terms than the apostolic succession. After 1660, the situation has stabilized in Europe. There's no real major redrawing of boundaries in Europe in spite of Louis XIV's best efforts until the time of Napoleon. So a stable political and religious situation in Europe, and the pan-Protestant thing becomes much less important to the English church than it had been in the previous century.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, I'll just ask a question to you in terms of, I mean, we're still looking in the modern age. If you look at Orthodoxy, Anglicanism, and Catholicism makes up 80% of the world's Christian population.
Mm-hmm.
But, that perspective, even back in the 1700s, we're seeing that explosion of non-apostolic churches. But it's kind of funny, is from my interpretation of reading, is that the British colonies never really seem to be too affected. I mean, in the sense of the church of the Revolution or the Civil War, or what was going on in England. It seemed like all the colonies at that time were staying a little bit more stable, because we were early on here in America. Anglicanism was well established. We had Puritanism in the North. We started seeing some other movements of some other churches, but
one of the things you have to remember is the early colonies were run by private corporations. So you've got the Massachusetts Company, you've got the Virginia Company, and they, because of their status as corporations, tended to be able to limit the influence of English custom in America. In the case of Virginia, the political will to have a bishop was just not there. They could send bishops out from England once the prayer book, they were sending clergy out from England. There was no, short of an act of the House of Burgesses here in Virginia, there was no endowment for a bishop. So there was no bishop. And further north, of course, they really didn't want anything to do with bishops at all. So as a result of this, the English colonies in America have an Episcopal church without bishops. Interestingly, the Lutheran church in the middle colonies has a similar sort of situation. Delaware is settled early on by the Swedes, and the Swedes make the pragmatic decision will have a consistory form of government in America until such time as they can send a bishop, which never happens, and eventually the Swedish churches in Delaware drift into the Episcopal Church around 1800. such as one of them's Gloria Dei in Philadelphia. That set off as a Swedish Lutheran church and eventually became Episcopalian. Similarly, in the 18th century, British interests in India were controlled by the East India Company, and clergy were supplied by SPCK and SPG, and a lot of those were Danish Lutherans using the English Book of Common Prayer. They were episcopally ordained, but not in the apostolic succession. So you have this, the whole 18th, 17th, 18th century picture is much more complicated than anybody, I think, suspects, particularly as high church propaganda in the late 19th century and the 20th century has tended to minimalize the exceptions. It's only in the 1960s, with the growth of the ecumenical movement, that people become interested in these experiments and strange relationships that you have between 1660 and 1860.
Right. Well, I mean, while last church, I did a church plant, we were at Christ Church, which is in Maryland over on Kent Island, which is the second oldest church because it was one of the first landings to Jamestown. And, it was never interrupted as an Anglican church. And I know many churches in Virginia were never
Virginia was
interrupted into people weren't really focusing in on what was going on in England at the time. And there was some great pride in some of these southern states, or well, not then, but
it's really very simple. Virginia was about making money.
Yeah.
They were happy with the church as it was. They didn't want to get dragged into all this rubbish in London. So the Commonwealth, the Protectorate in London basically allowed them to retain much of the prayer book and decided just to let it die a death of old age rather than, deliberately abolish it and provoke an adverse reaction in the colony. Because at some level, they must have conceived of the possibility that the Virginia colony could become the basis of a royalist enclave in the New World. So it was better for them to appease the Virginia colonists by retaining much of the trappings of Anglicanism rather than force a change of religion in Virginia.
Yeah, that was not somewhat the point, and you kind of grabbed into it very well, is that, some of these states are growing states into here, the English loyalty to the king and to, believe it or not, was very high. And
that's because they didn't have to live with him.
So
I mean, let's face it, in the 1630s, the 1640s, the 1650s, Virginia was sitting pretty. It was making a nice living off the tobacco trade. We had the House of Burgesses. We had our own democratic forms of government. The royal governor came over from England. They shoved him into Jamestown and said, "You sit there, do what you're supposed to do, and don't disturb the apple cart. We're all making a living. Thank you very much." And there was preparedness on the part of the royal governors to accept the fact that Virginia was a different place.
Well, the Hudson Company with Canada was even there by now too, which I don't know anything about the being up there, but it seems like from certain glances of readings, they never left the church either, never really got in squabbled, really probably more than we did in terms of less acceptance of outside religious groups. Now, more Indians, more fur trading, more isolated in terms of cold weather. But the governors there seem to be a little more tougher than the governors here. But, I'm just, that was always curious as why it never really seemed to translate. It seemed like England was its own. What's going on there was just so isolated that the rest of the world didn't seem to, hey, whatever happened there was there and not here. Yeah.
You're also in a period where the English Civil War takes place against the background of continental Europe is exhausted after the 30 years of the Wars of Religion. You have the rise of Sweden as a European power. You have the relative decline of the Holy Roman Empire, and the French are in disarray because of the death of Louis XIII and the consequent extended minority of Louis XIV. So as a result of that, the English Civil War takes place at a point in European history where, first of all, nobody in continental Europe is in a position to take advantage of Britain being in turmoil. The British colonies overseas are in a position where they can just basically carry on as usual, independent of what's going on back home. And the one rising power of the period, which is Sweden, has a relatively short-lived golden age. You've got Gustavus Adolphus, the military genius who stops the Protestant cause in the 30 Years' War from collapsing. I mean, the man was absolutely brilliant. By the way, he's the reason there were so many Scots in Sweden. The long and the short of the matter was that Sweden was just simply not that interested in the American colonies. And they were the only people who really could have taken advantage of the situation. The Dutch were too busy with the East Indies. The French were too busy with their regency. Spain was spent. Portugal was an appendage of Spain at the time. The Holy Roman Empire is declining. It's getting close to Voltaire's remark about it being neither holy nor Roman nor even an empire. So the Danes are on the downward spiral. Russia is relatively weak, and that's all the major players. So England was relatively lucky as to when it had its civil war. The colonists were somewhat separated from English concerns, and if you were a Puritan in New England, you probably welcomed the parliamentary regime, and if you were a planter in Virginia, you probably decided we need to find a way of working with these people. So it doesn't interfere with what we want to do. And it's all actually, from the American colonies' point of view, it's all rather civilized. It's only after 1660 that things change a little bit, because the old private colonies are slowly replaced by royal colonies. So Maryland becomes a royal colony, Massachusetts becomes a royal colony, Connecticut becomes a royal colony. The upshot of one of the numerous wars against the Dutch is a little place called New Amsterdam, is taken over by the British and renamed for Seamus O'Cacker as New York. And, that was the beginning.
I resemble that remark.
And the English there's a growing British interest in North America at the same time as the Dutch are concentrating more on the East Indies, because they realize Britain is becoming a sea power to rival them. And although England, the Royal Navy is generally on the losing side during the 1660s and the 1670s, the Dutch are aware of the fact that the British Navy is becoming strong enough to challenge their dominance of the North Atlantic. Furthermore, once there is an active alliance between the Dutch and the English after 1688, the two strongest naval powers in Northern Europe are allied against the French. And that is going to be the political context for much of the 18th century. Yeah, I mean, we're dealing with dynastic politics. William of Orange is married to a Stuart, which creates a marriage alliance between the English and the Dutch, which makes it less likely that they're going to fight in the first place. A little bit later on, when the Hanoverians are in power, there's a marriage alliance between England and Denmark. And these various dynastic alliances between the Protestant states of Europe are what define late 17th and 18th century politics, which is why we end up referring to the British royal family as our currently gloriously reigning Germans, because, you know, after George I, the usual situation for an English monarch is your father's a German, your mother's a German, you speak German, you go to Hanover because you own it, until because of Salic law, England and Hanover are divided in 1837. And it also influences churchmen. The English develop a very favourable attitude towards Lutheranism in the 18th century because, you know, you've got a Lutheran king. You know, they're no longer, you know, foreign and strange like they used to be. They're living in St. James's Palace.
All right,
I know
well,
it's not germane to what we've been talking about next week, but it kind of gives us a bit of context for next week.
does anybody else have a final question before we have the Archbishop close us in prayer? All right, Archbishop, would you please close us in a final prayer?
Let us pray. Almighty God, who didst give such grace unto thy holy apostle St. Andrew, that he readily obeyed the calling of thy Son, Jesus Christ, and followed him without delay, grant unto us all that we, being called by thy holy word, may forthwith give up ourselves obediently to fulfill thy holy commandments, through the same Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. All right. We'll see you guys.
Have a good evening.
Yes, you too. See you next week.
You bet.